Small Towns by Richard Tanner. A cursory glance would reveal nothing more sinister in the town of Hampton than one drunk man sitting on his porch singing softly to himself. On the outskirts, just east of Main Street, stands the lone gas station that guards the only entrance and exit into it. Once upon a time, it had been new and vibrant, a grand achievement for Earl Penley, his life's work. He was the first man to bring an air-conditioned building into Hampton, a feat that has never been topped since. Now, years after Earl's death, the Stockton Ghost stood only as a shrine to a town's once prosperous future. Occasionally, someone stopped by for a soda or a scratch-off, but the only frequent customers were the rats. The paint peeled from the building like bedrock from a quarry, each subsequent layer representing another milestone in history. The white layer was 9/11, the smoldy green, Vietnam, the sickening yellow was the day Earl killed himself. The building threatened to collapse at every strong wind, the whole town did, but something made it trudge on. Downtown held what little wealth the people had. City Hall was a retrofitted bank that went under in the mid-'80s. The drive-thru still existed and was used to pay the bills or taxes that the city demanded. Even in the country, people were too busy or lazy to get out of the car. All of the government buildings were like that. The police station used to be an old train depot. The train still ran, but it never stopped in Hampton. The conductor simply used it as a landmark to know they were on schedule. The lonesome whistle was used by the old-timers to mark the time as the days ticked by. Main Street housed 3 restaurants and a few boutiques. It was an ideal bohemian paradise for someone who would have read about it in a 70s Playboy article. There was a sushi bar that served dollar sushi and stayed in business only because they served bud. The Chinese joint 2 doors down, called Hong Kong Star, was owned by the same family that owned the sushi bar. This made them Hampton royalty, and the only ethnic folks to settle here. They were from Korea, but everyone called them Chinese or something a little more colorful. The other restaurant, the one that had always been, had at least 2 men at the bar, no matter the time of the day. Uncle Sam's was a dive, 1 dirt floor shy of a white trash dream. Their menu consisted mainly of chicken fried steak and bingo. No 2 things were the same. Every chair looked as if it were a hand-me-down from a failed restaurant before. The pictures adorning the walls were yellowed with age or grease, and the entire place smelled of cigarettes. It was a smell that would never fade, a reminder of how things used to be. Main Street also played home to 2 competing beauty shops, the Hair Barn, that catered to the blue-haired old women and the few remaining aristocratic South, and the New Vision Styles who tried their best to be modern. The pseudo-hip sensibility matched up perfectly with this town. The other storefronts were offices to the elite of Hampton, 1 accountant, 1 optometrist, and Jonathan Ackerman. Jonathan Ackerman was always a peculiar fellow, often prone to walks at night and to mutter to himself. Anyone headed home in the early hours of the morning would see his office light burning alone between the shadows of Main Street, and often they would see him, his sickly pale skin and too big of eyes, glowing in the moonlight as he stood at his door, debating some great issue with no one at all. The people of Hampton also found him odd, because no one was entirely sure what he did for a living. He had no clients from town and never left to attend appointments elsewhere. The only thing that folks were sure of was that in town planning and codes, Jonathan Ackerman's office was listed as business consultant. A few tried to have meetings with him, more for the hopes of uncovering something juicy than for wanting to be neighborly, and they always left with more questions than answers, and a queer story that added to the collective gossip. His office was filled from the floor to the ceiling with old books, some too worn to make out the titles, and none of the books seemed to be of the same subject. The shelves themselves were immaculate, not a speck of dust on them, as if Ackerman read through his entire library of thousands of books daily. Above his desk there hung countless accommodations and degrees from institutes in Massachusetts. Hampton was worlds away from there, and like his book, no degree was the same. One was held in psychology, and another in business. He was a certified priest and a lifeguard, the latter of which he would openly point out with a smile. Ackerman was a peculiar fellow, but not a bad one. Other than being a bit too mysterious, he was quite likable. This is how the people of Hampton were able to overlook things for so long. When Ackerman started leaving town every other day, it was all the locals could talk about. The old ladies of the Hare Barn were so happy he got a client big enough to keep him busy, while the ladies at New Vision giggled at the possibilities of Ackerman finding a mistress. The rumors brought smiles to almost everyone. It was a partial answer to the strange neighbor. These excursions happened for nearly 3 weeks, and then one night Ackerman didn't return. No one thought much of it. After all, he always kept to odd hours. However, when the next day ended and there was still no sign of him, people began to worry. They checked his house, they checked his office, and found nothing. Even Sheriff Owens secured the recent emergency service logs from neighboring towns. Nothing. A week later, with no special news or word, Ackerman was back at his office, arguing aloud to no one or himself. It was hard to be sure of which. He had apparently arrived in the middle of the night. No one saw him come back, but they were relieved he was safe. Ackerman received a flood of visitors and well wishes that morning. They wanted him to know that they saw him as one of their own and that they were so worried. They all left his office saying that it smelled horrible. He was unshaved and unkempt with bloodshot eyes slightly too big for his head. He looked as if he hadn't slept in years. And the smell. The town would talk of that smell for years to come. No one was sure where it came from, whether it was a body odor or some musty thing in the stack of boxes that sat behind him. Either answer would have made perfect sense, but no one stayed long enough to find out. They ran to the street after a brief and stuttered greeting, gasping for air. The excursion started back a week later. Each night, Ackerman returned with more boxes and looking more haggard. He also started spending his nights, day and any time not on the road, at his office. The smell was getting stronger. Passerbys could smell it from the streets. It was Friday when Sheriff Owens had to officially respond to the complaints. He's a very professional man for having such a laid-back town. His calls usually consisted of border disputes during lawn care season or a drunk in the winter. The hardest thing he'd ever seen since elected was a bad case of domestic abuse. Jimmy Evers beat the hell out of his wife Martha one night. It was a shock to everyone, but Owens had actually seen the poor girl. Her nose was broken and almost beat completely sideways. There wasn't an inch of skin on her face that wasn't bruised and swollen. She couldn't stand. She could barely speak. Owens almost killed Jimmy Evers that night. He kicked the door down and saw poor Martha lying in a heap on the ground, Jimmy standing over her, still holding a bottle. Owens rushed forward, throwing Jimmy into the wall, his gun pointed under his chin, hammer pulled back and finger on the trigger. He wanted to pull the trigger. He wanted to give Jimmy the punishment he deserved, but he was the sheriff. He's elected to keep the peace, not deal out his own private justice. Jimmy was arrested with a bruised lip and a black eye. The official report said it happened as he got into the car. The other report said Martha lost her eyesight. The odor was so bad by the time Owens made it to the front walk that he was pulling out a handkerchief. It was an overpowering smell of mold and decay and something he couldn't quite place. He knocked on the door and waited. Nothing. The smell was too strong to stay still for long. He knocked again, louder, and announced himself. "Mr. Ackerman, Sheriff Owens. I'm afraid I'm going to need a moment of your time." Owens leaned closer to the door and listened. There was someone moving, and it cast a shadow on the blinds. The laminate letters of J. Ackerman were starting to peel off the window. Before the sheriff had time to register any of this, the door opened, revealing Ackerman in a charcoal suit looking as haggard as ever. The smell that flooded from behind him almost caused Owens to vomit. Somehow he held back. His eyes watered, but his lunch stayed in its proper place. "Hello, Sheriff. Sorry, I didn't hear you right away. I was lost somewhere in my studies for my latest client." Ackerman smiled, revealing a few too many teeth. "Quite all right," said the sheriff through his handkerchief. "But there is an issue we gotta discuss." "Oh dear. Well, come in, please." Ackerman stepped sideways and held his hand out, gesturing the sheriff to enter. Owen's eyes went wide. No, thank you very much, Mr. Ackerman, but out here is fine. This will be quick. I've been receiving a few complaints, and now that I'm here, I can see they are not quite unfounded." Ackerman frowned. "But I don't understand. I've done nothing wrong here. I've been a model citizen." Owen raised his hand. "It's the smell. I've been getting several calls a day about the smell." Ackerman looked around and sniffed. "What smell?" "Are you kidding me? The smell that's so bad that I've got to hold this handkerchief to my face just so I can speak to you. You're going to have to do something about it, or the town's going to make me shut down your office until the situation is resolved." Ackerman's eyes narrowed, as did his smile. "Sheriff, I don't think I can let you do that. My most recent client has offered me a very lucrative deal, and shutting down will not be an option." He took a single step forward, but there was something in that movement that was so frightening that Owens found himself reaching for his gun. "As for the smell, Sheriff, perhaps you should talk to the restaurants. I've tried the sushi once and was out of commission for days. Their facilities were none too fresh either. Now, unless there's something more urgent than you need, I must get back to work." Ackerman turned and left without waiting for a response. Owen simply stood there, a little too confused to know how to proceed. The smell helped him find the answer as he retreated back to his car. The day finished without further incident. The smell lingered, but Owens was happy for the postponement. He didn't really know the protocol to close an office and building within city limits. He never had a need to know. Also, something about Ackerman scared the hell out of him. It wasn't his size. Ackerman was tall and slender, almost sickly looking, but in his eyes there was something menacing. Even when he was looking at you, it was as if he was looking through you, or to something just behind your shoulder. When he spoke, he was always kind and elegant, but he always carried an undertone that he knew something that you did not. And that smell. Owens knew that smell. He had smelled it once when he was a kid, when his grandfather died, and once again in his second year as sheriff, when he found Mrs. Smith dead from a stroke. That smell was death, and that scared him more than anything else. It rained in Hampton that night, and anyone driving down Main Street would have seen Jonathan Ackerman arguing violently with the empty air at his office door. As fate saw it, only one car drove by, the old brown sedan of Sheriff Owens. He was headed home when he saw the commotion, and despite every screaming warning in his head to keep driving, to get the hell out of Dodge, he stopped. It would prove to be a night that haunted him more than the sight of Martha Evers crumpled on that floor. Owen stepped out of the car and pulled on his hat. "Mr. Ackerman, what the hell are you doing?" Ackerman turned. "Go the fuck away." He stepped back into his office, slamming the door, still yelling at the empty room. Owen stepped up to the door and grabbed the handle. The smell was still there, and so was the fear, but fear of leaving something or someone dead with that crazed Ackerman was even stronger. He opened the door and stepped in. The place was still neat, but cluttered. Books were everywhere. Shelves overflowed onto the floor, the sofa, the tables. They were even stacked to the ceiling in some places. But they were so perfect. Nothing ajar and all the angles so straight, he would have had to use a level. The rug was vacuumed and the shelves were dusted, and something about the cramped room being in such order sent shivers through the sheriff. This didn't look like the lair of a madman. It looked like the obsession of a million of them. Everything was in its place and everything perfect. The sheriff cautiously looked around a stack of books and saw Ackerman kneeling at his desk. On it was the biggest computer he had ever seen. There were tubes snaking from the monitor into the tower, into the ceiling and the walls. The monitor was big enough to step through, and it became obvious that was where the smell was coming from. Ackerman mumbled something, and the computer hummed in response. The sheriff stared without breathing, trying to put some of these things together. He took one step closer and slipped on a book, falling to his knee. Ackerman was on top of him before he had a chance to turn his head. Ackerman thrashed, kicked, and scratched, ripping the sheriff's uniform and attacking him like a wild man. When the sheriff tried to restrain him, he yelled an ungodly sound and leaned forward, biting the sheriff's cheek and pulling out a chunk of flesh. The sheriff screamed, finally able to get Ackerman off of him. He pulled out his gun and fired wildly as Ackerman scrambled back toward him. One shot got him to the leg, another in the stomach. Ackerman and the sheriff's blood met between them. They both laid there for a while, unmoving, not speaking, just holding their wounds until the sheriff started to get up. "You have the right to remain silent, Ackerman." Ackerman giggled, as if he were a schoolboy hearing a dirty joke. "Silent? Why on earth would I be silent, Sheriff? You shot me. Because you bit me. After you invaded my private property without cause." The computer hummed. "Oh yes, I even verbally told you not to enter, didn't I? Didn't I?" Ackerman yelled and lunged forward, but instantly screamed out in pain. Fresh blood ran down from the wound on his stomach. "Don't you get it? Don't you get it that I know everything now? I don't have time for you, Sheriff." "Doesn't matter, Ackerman. You need a lawyer, and you need to shut up." The computer hissed and started to steam. "My client still needs me. He'll never let me go. I'm sorry, Sheriff, but I told you to go away." As the steam thickened, so did the smell, and Owens found himself getting tired. He started coughing and slid to the floor. Everything started to blur. He felt his eyes closing, but used all of his will to keep them open. Ackerman was on his knees in front of the computer. His wound had almost stopped bleeding. The computer started shaking and a fire broke out on the desk. Owens was losing his fight with sleep and dropped his gun, his eyes loosely focused on Ackerman and the computer. The fire was getting bigger, and Ackerman was crying. The tubes from the wall started shaking so violently that they were ripped free. The movement caused the monitor in the tower to rise safely above the fire. Before Owens went down for the count, he remembered hearing the train pass by, blaring its horn. It's midnight. Owens woke up on the street, rain in his face and the EMT by his side. He tried to speak, but only managed to cough. The fire department was able to maintain the fire pretty well, but Ackerman's office was as good as gone. Hong Kong Star and the Hair Barn would have a lot of cleanup and few insurance claims, but they would be open for business in the morning, with a few extra customers hoping to hear a bit of gossip. Everyone wanted to know more. Owens was admitted to the hospital in the neighboring town and kept overnight for observation. Physically, he was fine, a scar on the cheek and some bruises on his legs, but otherwise looking no less to the wear. He never was able to get rid of the odor, though. He could still smell it. Even years down the road, he would find himself spraying Lysol all over the station because he was sure it was there. He also switched to a typewriter, leaving any computer work to be done by the deputies. It was an easier transition than he had expected. The only thing that really happened to the sheriff were the dreams. Every night he would see Ackerman and his client watching him, waiting for his next move. They never found Ackerman's body, and when the investigators saw no sign of the computer either, the sheriff dropped it. Said it must have been a hallucination. Still, everyone in Hampton talked about this otherworldly computer for months. The only person in town who held one of the missing reels of the night was Earl Penley Jr., who still held the title of the oldest man in town. He was sitting outside the gas station drinking the private selection that he hid from his wife. He sat on an old vinyl folding chair yellowed by age, smoke, and gas, half asleep and half drunk when the fire started. He didn't move and didn't try to help. The only thing he did was take a swig and grunt when Ackerman dashed by. Ackerman ran like the madman he was into the darkness on the way out of Hampton. He was dragging a jumbled mess of wires with him. Penley never brought this up. He didn't have any love for Ackerman. But on the same note, he never had ill will for him either. Ackerman was just a peculiar fellow, with eyes a little bit too big. But of course, some people said that about the Penleys as well. Any way he looked at it, everyone was better off with Ackerman gone. Hampton was a small town with very little to do. A little rumor would do better than a lot of truth, because for them, they would always need to know just a little bit more.